Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And today we have to get into the meat of fundamentals of evidence analysis, which is probably going to give most of you a headache. There was a time in my life where it gave me a headache trying to keep track of all this stuff in my head. Well, finally I gave up trying to keep track of it all in my head. So I have this book, Evidence Explained. So it keeps track of it for me. So I use it as a reference. I use it often. You've seen me use it for the past couple of weeks. And I refer to it all the time. And you too, as a genealogist, will refer to it all the time. As I've said before, the first two chapters of Evidence Explained, or Evidence for that matter, its precursor, are the most important things that you can learn in genealogy. And if you understand those two chapters, one of which we've already gone over, then you will become a much better genealogist. And being a much better genealogist has a lot to do with two things. One of them is your ability to analyze records, to know not only what they tell you on the surface, but what they tell you under the surface also. Every record has a story, and your job as a genealogist is to pull that story out of that record. If you just are looking at the ink on the paper, you're doing nothing more than looking at the book cover. You have to delve deeper. You have to analyze that record. Reading a record and transcribing it into your database or into your family tree is not doing analysis. It's transcription. Not the same thing. You have to create in yourself a mindset that constantly questions, why does it exist? How did it come into being? What will I learn from this? Where did this record come from? Where will this record lead me? Always I ask the questions of where did it come from? Why does it exist? And where will it lead me? And none of that has anything to do with the ink that exists on the paper. You want to create that analytical mindset. Now, one of the problems that you're going to encounter is that records and the ink that are on those records, some of the ink is really, really good. Some of the ink isn't so good. And what I mean by that is when you analyze this record, you have to be aware of what's important in the record, but you also have to be aware of what can you trust in the record because of the information that's in the record. In other words, who's the informant, for example. But there may be pieces of a record that are valid and important to your analysis, and there may be pieces of the record that detract from your analysis, and you have to resolve those issues. One of the things we don't do as genealogists, in fact, the first sentence in the first section of this Fundamentals of Evidence Analysis chapter is, as history researchers, we do not speculate. Did you know you were a history researcher? So let's change that around. As genealogists, we do not speculate. Except that we do. We just don't call it speculation, we call it hypothesis. We create a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we come up with a theory, and we get to our answer. So we must possibly speculate in the beginning, but not in the end. In other words, speculation is part of your analysis process, but it has nothing to do with the end product. She says and by she I mean Elizabeth Shown Mills. And also remember, I'm talking for myself today. I'm not talking for Elizabeth. I'm not talking for the Board for Certification of Genealogists. This is just Craig Scott running his mouth about how he feels about stuff. You can believe me or not. Test. You can't test unless you have more than one record, because you have nothing to test it against. So recognize that in the second sentence, we test. Well, recognize you can't test a record unless you have something to test it against, which means you have to have done an exhaustive search, which we've talked about, and you have to have more than one record to look at. We critically observe and carefully record. Well, we're going to do that anyway. I would hope that we would critically observe. I'm not sure that critically observe means that we're going to observe and be critical. Not quite the same thing as critically observe, but that may be just me. In other words, I'm not going to trust anything I see unless I see it balanced with other records. Carefully record, well, that's a citation issue. That also is a make sure that I know what I'm doing. Am I doing an abstract? Am I doing a transcript? How am I doing this? And we're going to have to talk about that at some point, the difference between abstracts and transcripts and all that kind of stuff, and how to do them differently, and where one is appropriate and where one is also appropriate or not. And then we weigh the accumulated evidence. Accumulated evidence means more than one record, but also recognize that there's more than one bit of evidence in a single record. Analyzing the individual parts as well as the whole, that's what I'm talking about, without favoring any theory. You have a problem if you have bias, and we all have bias, but what you want to do is to attempt to eliminate your bias. You want desperately to descend from this person, and that's going to mess you up. This is why we always go from what we know. We don't pick an ancestor out in somebody's tree and say, I want to descend from that person. That would be a good idea if I could descend from that person. And then attempt to prove that you descend from that person by coming down the tree to you. It very rarely works. Now, I'm not saying that I don't ever do that, but I surely don't do it 5 or 6 generations away. I may do it 1 generation away because I haven't been able to figure out who the parents are, but I see a person of that name, of that surname, so I may evaluate that person to see what records they can provide me that might help me figure out who this person's parents are. So it's not favoring a theory, it's just I'm looking at somebody because I can't go any farther. I've hit a brick wall that I probably made myself. So anyway. So bias, ego, ideology, patronage, prejudice, pride, or shame cannot shape our decisions, but they will. So we have to be very careful that none of that comes into play as we appraise our evidence. So you have to be the consummate detective, not the consummate orator. I've always said that when we create brick walls, we usually do them ourselves. We usually create someone that doesn't exist or attach someone to someone that we want to attach them to, unknowingly maybe that we made that attachment. Or we listened to some ancestry family tree and just plugged it into our tree kind of thing. So you want to be careful that you recognize that many times your own bias, ego, ideology, whatever you want to call it, can be your own worst enemy. We've made it through the first paragraph. At this rate, it should only take us 5 or 6 days to finish this. So the next thing that she talks about is historian Barbara Tushman, who famously described evidence as a kaleidoscope. And she did that in a book I've actually read. She did that, if you look at the footnote on page 15, she did that in The Guns of August. That's a book I've read. She also has 2 other books that I've read. And one of them is my favorite book of all time kind of book. One was Stilwell and the American Experience in China. That was an interesting read for me, but remember, I'm a military guy. But probably my favorite book that she ever wrote was probably the one she did in 1988, The First Salute. And it's a view of the American Revolution. It's by far one of my favorite books on the American Revolution. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. She is an easy read. She teaches as she reads. She is just so much fun to read. So, but she describes that, you know, when you look at a kaleidoscope, you see shards of pieces all working together. And that's what she's talking about. And how you turn that kaleidoscope can, in fact, determine what the picture looks like on the inside. How many of you have ever played with one of those things? I don't know where mine is. I used to have one. I think I used to have two. But anyway, recognize that evidence is not random like a kaleidoscope is. And that one view can be as good as another. That's not true. Experienced researchers know that through analysis and correlation, we're going to get to that view that, in fact, exemplifies the evidence that we have in front of it. She then goes on to talk about chains of records. And if you've listened to me over the last 151 videos, you know how I feel about you have to know about the record that comes before and you have to know about the record after, and to always recognize that there are at least 2 copies of a record, if not 3. So there are multiple chains. And records come in chains. No record exists in isolation. It only exists in isolation because your exhaustive search hasn't been exhaustive enough, or you don't understand enough about the records. So we turn to page. So moving on, she teaches us that as careful researchers, we cannot apply an easy generic label meaning reliable or unreliable. I don't discuss sources that way. I don't discuss information that way. I don't discuss evidence that way. Because to do so, in my mind, is to create a label that is done in isolation. Now, there are some publications that I trust more than others. Adventures in Person is a good example. The Great Migration Begins is a good example. So there are things that I don't, that if they say it was this deed, then I believe it was that deed. Now, if I don't know you or don't know your research and you say it was this deed, I'm probably going to want to look at that deed just because that's me, because I don't trust. But there are some people who have demonstrated that they actually know what they're doing in this business, and you don't have to worry about them as much. And you'll know who they are as time goes by. She goes on to say that types of documents, not an issue, and that we can't assign numerical values to pieces of information and add up a score to decide whether we should believe something we have found. You'll remember, as I talked about evidence yesterday, I said I don't weight them. I don't care. And this is why. Because to weight them would be to ascribe some unknown numerical value to a record. Don't care. I care about how it exists on the playing field, how it exists on my dining room table, as all the other records exist on my dining room table. And then she says, we cannot base conclusions on the number of times a source or fact is cited. And I've said that to you many times also, that you could have 14 sources, 13 of them are derivative, and 13 can be wrong, and only one is original, and that's the right one. So 13 times they said this, and one time they said that, and I'm sorry, these 13 times were wrong. Remember my great-grandmother and how many marriage dates she has. I have a civil record, I have a church record, and I have something in her own handwriting that all give a different date. How am I going to weight that? I can decide which one I'm going to trust, and I've decided to trust the civil record, but what can I say? Just recognize that 2 of those are what she describes as dubious factoids. Now, why are they dubious? They're dubious because in relationship to the civil record, they don't match. The other thing you have to remember is that research is not quantity, it's quality. An exhaustive search is not an issue about how many records can I find. It's an issue about how many appropriate records can I find. How many records, in fact, are part of this, need to be part of this analysis. So the fact that I've collected 500 records to deal with this issue doesn't mean a thing, because a good number of those records don't have anything to do with this thing. But I still collected them. So accumulation of data is not a thing. Reasonably exhaustive search is, and recognize that what you're having to deal with is quality, not quantity. The other thing that you have to remember is that genealogy never ends. The fact that you've created a proof doesn't mean that that proof can't be overturned tomorrow. Because that Bible record you've spent 20 years looking for, all of a sudden is found because you published something and somebody said, I have a Bible record, it doesn't match that. Or I have something else. Or your exhaustive search wasn't exhaustive. Or, we do these proofs because we wish to have them stand the test of time so that when somebody questions what we've done, we have the information to demonstrate how we came to that conclusion. And we hope that if they have a different conclusion, they can show us how they came to their conclusion. And with their new data and our old data, we can combine them together and come to a more appropriate proof, a new proof. So recognize that nothing ever stops. It never ends. Just because you said X 10 years ago doesn't mean it will be X 10 years from now. Records are becoming more and more available every day. So we've gotten through the first section. Oh, wait, before I go in there, I really should talk about the concept of information in this process and how we apply every conceivable test for authenticity, for contemporaneousness, and credibility of the informants. So we want to know who the informants are. So I skipped the informants, and I'm sorry. So the next section deals with completeness of research. And all I'm going to say is about this is what I just said. Research is never complete. There just comes a point where you decide that you found enough information to, in your opinion, create a proof that will stand the test of time, stand scrutiny, and it will last forever, which it won't do. You can't anticipate that it will last forever, but your goal is to ensure that your analysis, your research, your proof is complete enough that it will stand scrutiny. And this is a problem that we will have because it's only over time that you learn whether your proof will actually stand scrutiny or not. Because you might believe in the beginning of your life as a genealogist, you believe you have everything lined up and it'll stand scrutiny. But if you were to put that package away for 10 years and been a genealogist for another 10 years and pulled it out, you would have probably a decidedly different view of how competent you were 10 years to do that, and you would make changes. That's what's happened in my life, where things I did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I look at them again, I go, why didn't I do this? How come I forgot that? Didn't I know about that? So with experience, you get better at this. Remember that some things are going to be hidden from the world for a long time, but eventually it might show up, and that may be your ruination. But then maybe it won't. Maybe it will support the conclusions that you had already come to. So the next section deals with, well, let me talk about, before I go to the next, this is going to happen all the time. You always want to look at her last paragraph of anything she writes. Elizabeth is like that. If you're going to skim something, don't skim the last paragraph. Always read her last paragraph, because that's where she sums everything up and lays it out for you. And what she says, all things considered, our task as history researchers is to learn the sources, learn the methods, learn the standards, and apply them as carefully and as diligently as possible. I think I said that, but I think her words might be better than mine. Might. Did you hear that? Her words are better than mine. So in the next section, we're going to deal with conclusions, hypothesis, theory, and proof. every assertion that we make has to be supported by proof. Don't just throw stuff out there and hope it'll stick to the wall. However, proof is not synonymous with a source. Notice the use of the word a source. You cannot have a proof with a source. You can only have a proof because you've compared that record to other records. In other words, you're creating a composite of the information that's laying on the dining room table before you. And you're confident that you're dealing with quality materials that were independently created, that means originals, and that they accurately represent the original circumstances. And recognize, as I've just said more than once, that there is no such thing as a proof that cannot be rebutted. You just have to plan that your proof is going to be rebutted, and you just have to prepare your proof in such a way that that process is delayed. And that largely happens because we weren't there when the history was created. And we're not the people with the eyewitness accounts. And recognize that eyewitness accounts are not necessarily reliable. Every conclusion we reach about circumstances, events, identities, and kinship is simply a decision we base on the weight of the evidence we have assembled. Our challenge is to accumulate the best information possible and to train ourselves to skillfully analyze and interpret what it has to say. And that's what makes you a genealogist. The ability to accumulate the best information possible and to be trained sufficiently that you can skillfully analyze and interpret what that evidence has to say, what those records have to say. Typically, she says, we'll reach conclusions of three types. One is a hypothesis, which is nothing more than a proposition, based on the analysis of the evidence at hand. Basically, I'm going to use that to do further research. A hypothesis is not a proof. A hypothesis is a roadmap to move forward. And it's not a tentative conclusion. In other words, this is not a conclusion, this is just a proposition. A theory, however, is a tentative conclusion. In other words, I'm pretty sure that I'm on the right track, but I haven't gone far enough. I'm still short of all the pieces that I need to ensure that I have a proof that will stand the test of time. So I may start with a hypothesis. That might get me to a theory, but that theory by itself will not get me to a proof. A proof is a conclusion based on a sum of all the evidence that supports some valid assertion or deduction. A conclusion drawn from assembling information from many sources. Proof must be backed by thorough research and documentation, by reliable information that is correctly interpreted and carefully correlated, and by a well-reasoned and written analysis of the problem and evidence. The only problem I have with that is that use of the word reliable. Okay? Because reliable is not a word I use. Because we have the process map and we have those words that we use in the process map. As long as you continue to use those words that are in those three columns of the process map, original, derivative, authored, when you're talking about a source, or when you're talking about information, then you are talking about primary and secondary or undetermined. And if you're talking about evidence, you are talking about, see how this makes your head explode? So I need to go look at my process map because even though I talked about it yesterday, I skipped. In the back of my head, I don't have the three pieces of evidence, so I go to the back, and of course it's direct, indirect, and negative. I don't know why I couldn't remember those. I mean, I've talked about direct and indirect evidence with people today, and instances of both. So that's the terminology we want to use. We don't want to use the terminology reliable. Records aren't reliable. There's something having to do with those three columns in the process map. So it could be primary, direct, it could be original, primary, and direct. That's how I want to describe it. I don't want to describe it as reliable because they could have lied. Don't know yet, do I? So that's my only problem there. Also recognize that conclusions cannot always be reached. You can't always come up with a proof. And that's one of the tough things about genealogy is you can't always come up with a proof. And you may not come up with a decision based on the information that you've collected. It just means you haven't gone far enough. You haven't got sufficient evidence to do what you want to do. So that gets us through 1.3. Remember hypothesis, theory, and proof? Don't pretend your hypothesis is a proof. Don't pretend that your theory is a proof. Please. Don't pretend that your proof is a proof until you're absolutely positive and sure that it's a proof that will stand the test of time and survive scrutiny. She goes on and talks about facts versus assertions or claims. You know, I can remember I was going to be a history major when I went to Sewanee. And the first day I was in class, my first history class, my professor, Anita Goodstein, a woman I love dearly, told me, the first question she asked is, what is history? And the conclusion that was drawn by the time it was all said and done was history was the opinion of the historian. And at that moment, I knew I could never be an historian because I'm a genealogist. Even in that day, at 17 years old, I was a genealogist, in my head anyway. I was doing it all wrong at the time, but that's beside the point. And I dealt in facts. I did not deal in opinions, so I could not be a historian because I wasn't about to deal in opinions. I wanted to deal in facts. So for some reason, I became a psychology major. Now, who knows why that happened? So I'm not a person who's in favor of facts anymore because I don't deal from a position of this is a fact. I deal from the position that I can assert this or claim this based on its relationship with other records. And it seems to my mind that it is true. So I don't deal with facts anymore. I can assert something or I can claim something, but the minute I claim it as a fact, I'm going to find a record that tells me it ain't a fact. It isn't a fact. So stay away from the concept of facts. You can make assertions, you can make claims. And the issue is, usually when people talk about facts, they're talking about a single record. And so single records can't be facts to begin with. Records can assert or they can claim, and they have to be balanced against the other records. There's also the issue that she brings up in the final paragraph in this section is that you could, and many times I have, looked at the same record and come to two different conclusions. And those conclusions may not be congruent. So therefore, it's possible in a single record to find conflict. And we'll talk about that at some point. The next section deals with family history standards. And she talks about modern family history deals heavily from law and its handling of evidence. Well, throw that away. We handle evidence in accordance with the genealogical proof standard, which is much stricter than law is. We're not dealing from the old-style genealogist preponderance of evidence situation. We're dealing from the perspective of the genealogical proof standard. So you should not be talking about the preponderance of the evidence is. It should be described as using the genealogical proof standard, X. So we don't want to talk ever about this legal standard. And even when we go to court, which is not something I've ever done, but I have lots of fellow genealogists who are willing to go to court. I'm not. and they have to be aware of the preponderance of the evidence because it's a legal standard, but what they're going to bring to the court is the genealogical proof standard. And then how the court evaluates it, that's an entirely different deal, but there's no way that using the genealogical proof standard is less than the preponderance of the evidence. If sufficient evidence does not exist to accept or reject a hypothesis, we can and should simply delay a decision until that evidence is found or accumulated. That's why some projects take us 30 years. But records are becoming more and more available all the time. So recognize that as a genealogist, we are stricter than social scientists, lawyers, anybody else. And there's good reason for this, because I'll put it very simply. People doing genealogy create crap, and that crap represents our profession. So we personally, as professional genealogists, have to ensure that we don't create crap, and that our material, our product, will stand scrutiny. Preponderance of evidence allows for a margin of error. The social sciences allow for a margin of error. As genealogists, we do not allow for a margin of error. If there is a margin of error, we have to deal with it, and we have to eradicate it. We cannot be publishing proofs that have a margin of error. Now, don't misunderstand. Errors will occur, but we have to approach this from the mindset that errors are unacceptable. And then finally, in section 1.5, under Fundamentals of Evidence on page 19, she actually talks about the genealogical proof standard by just giving us the genealogical proof standard. So we'll skip over that because we're going to spend a lot more time on that. Then we have to deal with the issue in 1.6 on page 19 of levels of confidence. Now, I don't use these to begin with. I use these in my end products. And I sit down with this section of the book when I do it. And the words are certainly, which means the author has no reasonable doubt about the assertion based on sound research and good evidence. Probably means the author feels the assertion is more likely than not. I don't use certainly very often. I use probably a lot. Likely, in my mind, means I haven't done enough research, but it actually means the author feels some evidence supports the assertion, but the assertion is far from proved. So that tells me I can get away with probably and publish a proof because I'm using the word probably. But if I'm using the word likely in my proof, I haven't done enough work. I'm not ready for that proof yet. Possibly, the author feels the odds weigh at least slightly in favor of the assertion. Possibly is preponderance of the evidence. 51%. I haven't done enough research yet. Apparently, the author has formed an impression or a presumption, typically based on common experience, but has not tested the matter. I'm not ever going to use that. I'm not ever going to, write something that says apparently. Now, I should qualify that. There may be one line somewhere in this entire construct of my proof where I might use the word apparently, or possibly, or likely. But there's no preponderance of any of those words in any of my proofs. And then the concept of perhaps, as the suggestion that the idea is plausible, I'm not to the right stage yet. So recognize that it's a good, if you're looking at your proof and you're looking at these words and levels of confidence and you can't say certainly or probably, I don't think you're done. I think you need to do more work. Now recognize that my concept of do more work is I don't do quote professional research based on hourly, based on that kind of stuff. So, I may be down to the wire and there's no more money. So maybe you may be forced to do that, but I wouldn't describe it as a proof. I would describe it as a, here's my report. Here's what I found. This is what I think. But this is not proven. This is not a genealogical proof statement. This is just a summary of my research and make it clear that it's not a proof. So the next section, 1.7, deals with objectivity. No matter what we do, we're going to bring bias into the situation, but we want to make sure that we don't make people evil and we don't make people heroes, that we don't defend people and we don't prosecute people either. This isn't actually something that I do. I'm not into supporting a specific image that this person may have created or whatever. It's just not my thing. I don't write that well to be able to do that. So the next section is 1.8, which is presentism, which is an interpretation of the past by present standards. I don't even want to talk about that. From the perspective of people do that all the time. The fact that Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder in a time of slaveholding is not a derogatory statement about Thomas Jefferson. He really didn't have a choice. If he were a slaveholder today, all right. Applying today's standards, he's a terrible person. But in his life, he was not a terrible person. He just lived his life in the time that he lived. And by applying our present standards backwards, we create a conundrum that will be very difficult for us to deal with. Largely because it's going to distort our view of actually what's going on. You can read that section. Just recognize that we're obliged to preserve the evidence as it is presented to us. Our job is not to modify it to make it more modern. Then we have the issue in 1.9 of quantity versus quality, and I've sort of talked about that. We want to look for multiple sources, but the fact that we found multiple sources does not mean that we've actually accomplished anything if it doesn't contribute to our ability to determine what is original, what is derivative, and what is authored, so that we can begin the steps of analysis. So recognize that we want to find that independent origin, that original source at every opportunity, and that is much better, that quality is much better than, again, 14 records that say something else entirely different, but it is an original. Section 1.10 deals with technical knowledge, and accurate evaluations of evidence requires researchers to have sound technical knowledge of the materials they use. And I don't know how else to put that you have to have an understanding of the records. If you evaluate the records before you understand them, you're going to get yourself into trouble. I'm really good at military records, and I have a very good technical understanding of how to evaluate military records. I can't say that I have the same technical understanding of how to evaluate fur trader records, because I've never touched a fur trader record in my life. It's just I'm always whenever this comes to mind, I always think of the fur trade and Joy Reisinger, and how she was by far the number one, in my mind, expert on the fur trade. I don't understand lighthouse records either because I haven't used them enough. But Sandy Clooney knows how to use lighthouse records. So you find that there are people who know how to use certain records, and you want to hang around with them. You want to, at conferences and stuff, whenever we have conferences again, you want to listen more than talk. And those of you who know me know I talk more than I listen, but I am learning actually how to listen better. But you want to know that you have to have sound technical knowledge of the material. And one of the ways you learn that is you learn what the precursors are and you learn what the successors are. You know what created the record, you know why the record was created, you know why somebody might lie on the record, and you know what comes next. Those are all pieces of technical knowledge, and they're all part of your analysis. So going to page 22, section 111 talks about truth. And historian Robert Wink's writing, "The past was real, but the truth is relative." And he did that in Historian as a Detective, Essays on Evidence, back in 1968. Unlike Justice Porter Stewart's famed definition of obscenity, I cannot say I know it when I see it. We won't. Historical truth is physically pliable, so basically we're not looking for truth. We're looking for proof, not truth. So take truth and pull it out of your head and throw it away. Truth is like facts, words we don't use. So that takes us through the first 11, which are the basic issues. Then we go into classes of evidence, and we've talked about those. And then we go into some problematic concepts. And those, I'm going to let you read those problematic concepts beginning on page 26 for your own. But basically, the concept that I want to get across to you in section 116 is use the words on the process map. There are not primary sources. There are not direct sources. There are original sources. There are derivative sources, and there are authored sources. So most of the problematic concepts that you're going to encounter are because you're using the wrong words. So if you use the right words, you won't have a problem. And that's why I'm not going to spend any time on it. Use the right words. And if you see someone who's not using the right words, that means their research is being drawn into question, and you have to be careful with it because they're not using the right words. Now, some of the other pieces that she talks about in problematic concepts are the names, the same rule. Ignore it. In fact, I ignore names. I've talked to you before about the peso dance. I'm more interested in the records that surround someone than I am in the name of the individual. Don't tell me that Philip spelled with one L is different from Philip spelled with two L's. Don't tell me that Mac C means one thing and MAC needs another, and M, a single quote, means something else. They all mean the same as far as I'm concerned. There's no additional insight that I can gather from two L's versus one L. There's no additional insight that I can gather from MAC versus MC. There's no, in fact, how a name is pronounced, you may not even know how the name is pronounced because you're looking it on the paper. After all, is Taliaferro Taliaferro or is it Tolliver? Is Stanton Stanton or is it Staunton? Is Botetourt or is it Botetourt? Is it Buford or is it Beaufort? Now that's a trick question because it depends on what state you're in. There is also this maxim out there called the three-source rule. Some researchers contend that proof requires three sources, all reporting the same fact. Okay, I got two letters for you in regards to that one. I think the first one is B. Can you figure out what the second one is? So that gets us through 121. I am going to skip processed record formats and transcriptions and textual criticism and that kind of stuff because I'm going to deal with those separately in other talks. But I would urge you to read them. I've spent enough time today, I hope, in getting you through up into processed records and formats up to page 28 that you'll know about how I feel about the matter. There are some pieces that go beyond there that are going to be helpful to you in regards to the issues of authenticity versus credibility, the informant's person. And I could spend a talk on each one of these, and I very well might. The one thing that I need to talk about, though, especially as it relates to sources, and which you may miss in all of this, is the issue of microfilm versus the lack of color. You can have a record that in its original has color on it, but in its microfilm, it's in black and white, so you can't see the color. And I would just caution you that if you've got a record that is on microfilm. You want to see if you can get to the original record because there might be color on it. And the color, especially in a military record, color means something that was, red means something that was added later, not something that was added in the very beginning. I just want to leave you with that point. We're going to come back to this, but we're not going to treat it as fundamentals of evidence analysis. We're going to deal it as, what do you do with duplicates? What are you going to do with transcriptions? What are you going to do with image copies? Those kind of things. So we'll deal with those separately day by day. And I probably won't deal with those before we get back into the genealogical proof standard. The next thing we'll be talking about is analysis. And what I may do is talk about those as we deal with the analysis section. Because today we really haven't talked about actually doing analysis. We've just talked about getting to the point where we can actually do analysis. So our next step is to examine the genealogical proof standard, talk about analysis, and then start looking at the pieces of analysis. So this has been Craig. This has been a long-winded Just Genealogy. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed giving it. I feel like it's time for a glass of single malt scotch. I may just give myself that to celebrate 150 videos. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I appreciate your support. We're up to like 411 people now and almost 800 views, pretty close. Next couple of days we should get there. This one is long enough that it will probably get us there. And if I didn't say that I appreciated your support just 2 minutes ago, and I just said it again, I do appreciate your support. I enjoy doing this, and it's only through people like you that I can continue to do it, because I have to have an audience. Besides, I'm a narcissist. I have to have an audience. See what I mean? You all have a great day. I know I am. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow is Book Sunday.